The broadcast echoed across the galaxy, transmitting through the screens of every alien soldier stationed at the forward base. Alien commanders stood with smug expressions, voices filled with contempt as they ridiculed Earth's idea of camouflage. "Observe," one sneered, gesturing at a holographic display of a human soldier covered in mud and leaves. "Earth's finest hiding like animals in the dirt. Pathetic." Laughter rippled through the ranks as they reveled in their perceived superiority. "We'll make sport of this one. Let the troops witness the futility of primitive tactics." Behind their lines, the alien soldiers smirked, thoroughly convinced of the commander's words. Advanced cloaking devices, invisibility fields, and neuroblocking systems were standard in their army. How could a creature hiding under leaves and twigs pose any real threat? Unbeknownst to them, a lone Navy SEAL was observing everything in silence, perched deep within the thick vegetation just beyond the alien base. He had been sent to gather intel, but the mockery now playing out on their screens added a new edge to his mission. With every word they uttered, the SEAL's focus sharpened, his training and instincts humming in readiness. He'd faced arrogance before, on battlefields and in hostile territories. The trick was to let the overconfident dig their own holes. A flicker on his handheld scanner told him they'd locked onto his general area. Moving with deliberate care, he shifted, pressing his back against the rough bark of a tree and sinking lower into the shadows. Through the dense foliage, he could hear the rustling footsteps of approaching alien soldiers. Their voices carried a mixture of amusement and contempt, betting on who would be the first to flush him out. "Let's play with him a little," one voice cackled, a leader perhaps, as they drew nearer. "Watch as the Earthling scurries." The SEAL breathed slowly, his pulse steady as he evaluated the terrain. Every branch, every shadow was part of his arsenal. He could hear them getting closer, advancing in a loose formation with weapons at the ready. They didn't seem to realize how the dense jungle would work against them, how the heavy humidity and rustling leaves could mask his movements. Every step he took was a calculated risk, blending seamlessly into the landscape they thought he was hiding from. He let a small rock slip from his grip, rolling it down a nearby slope. The sound was faint, barely audible to human ears, but the alien soldiers immediately tensed, sweeping their weapons in its direction. Some glanced at each other, the overconfidence starting to waver as the unseen figure led them deeper into unfamiliar territory. The SEAL moved again, a barely perceptible shift to his left. He let the jungle do the work for him, concealing him as he circled around, inching closer to the main alien force from behind. His every move was a lesson in patience, letting the underbrush and shadows blend him into the landscape. The alien commanders, watching from afar, grew impatient. They ordered their soldiers to tighten their formation, assuming the human was simply cowering somewhere nearby. But with each passing minute, their expressions shifted subtly, from amusement to irritation. Then, with a quick flicker of movement, the SEAL made his first calculated strike. A soldier at the rear let out a strangled gasp, his weapon falling from limp fingers as he dropped to the ground. The other aliens whipped around, alarmed, but saw only the dense thicket. The commanders, observing the feed, fell silent. "What was that?" one of them snapped, his tone edged with disbelief. "Perhaps he's more of a nuisance than we thought," another muttered, trying to maintain the arrogance, but there was an undertone of uncertainty now. The SEAL retreated into the shadows, his senses hyper-aware as he heard the alien troops frantically regroup, trying to account for their missing comrade. Their laughter was gone, replaced by muttered questions and uneasy glances. The high-tech gear they so prided themselves on couldn't pick up his trail. He was a ghost, slipping through their ranks, and they were starting to realize that the human they'd dismissed might be something more than they anticipated. Back in the command post, the alien leaders exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't the spectacle they promised their troops. With a grim expression, the lead commander issued new orders, deploying more soldiers and warning them to remain alert. They weren't laughing now. The SEAL moved in silence, attuned to the jungle's natural rhythm, every sense heightened. He knew this terrain better than the aliens could comprehend. Every leaf, branch, and shadow was an ally. As the alien troops searched in vain, he used their own confusion against them, making no sound, disturbing nothing as he blended seamlessly into his surroundings. His gear, primitive by alien standards, was lightweight and silent, his uniform textured to mimic the leaves and shadows around him. This wasn't just camouflage. It was survival honed through years of training and instinct. The alien troops advanced, sweeping the area, their high-tech sensors scanning, whirring with constant attempts to detect him. They relied on machines to see and hear, trusting entirely in technology that should have made him visible. But all they found was an endless wall of green, thick vines, and mossy branches that offered no sign of human presence. Each time they thought they caught something, he was already elsewhere, slipping just out of reach, leaving nothing but a faint rustle. One of the soldiers crouched, examining the ground where he'd passed minutes before, but the forest floor held no clues. The seal had used leaves to obscure his tracks, shuffling debris to cover his trail. The alien soldier looked around, frustration etched in his face, and motioned to his comrades to move on. As they advanced, the seal positioned himself above, lying flat on a thick branch, watching. His eyes traced their movements, noting every weapon, every piece of armor. He recognized their patterns, the hesitation in each step, the small gestures of doubt as they struggled to adapt to the oppressive heat and dense foliage. The jungle was starting to wear them down, their movements grew slower, their eyes darting with increasing uncertainty. From his perch, he spotted a lone soldier lagging behind, scanning with a device that emitted a soft blue glow. The seal watched carefully, tracking the soldier's hand movements and noting the device's range. When the alien turned his back, the seal dropped down silently behind him, swiftly disabling him with a precise, silent strike. The soldier crumpled, unconscious, as the seal slipped away, back into the shadows without leaving a trace. When the others discovered their fallen comrade, panic rippled through them. The soldiers regrouped, their voices raised, and for the first time, doubt flickered in their eyes. The jungle, which they had entered with arrogant certainty, now seemed hostile, alien in a way they hadn't anticipated. They began whispering among themselves, each glance over their shoulder betraying their fear. The seal kept to the perimeter, silently watching, his face impassive as he observed the growing fracture in their confidence. They were losing their grip, their vaunted technology unable to penetrate the dense jungle cover or locate him. His instincts told him to press the advantage, but he waited, allowing their nerves to fray further, letting their fear grow. The alien commander's voice came through their communication devices, barking orders, urging them to stay vigilant. But the soldiers' faces betrayed them, their bravado was gone. They clustered closer, gripping their weapons, eyes darting to every rustle in the underbrush. In their desperation, they fired into the trees, but the jungle swallowed the sound, the gunfire fading into the thick, humid air. With a calculated move, the seal crept around, picking off another alien who had wandered too far from the group. This time, the soldiers witnessed the takedown, but they saw only a blur, a ghost slipping in and out of sight. Their tech had betrayed them, leaving them helpless in a place where instincts mattered more than gadgets. The alien commanders watched from their remote view, their faces grim, the once mocking smiles replaced with frustration. Their soldiers were supposed to be invincible, backed by technology centuries ahead of humanity's. Yet here, in this wild terrain, their reliance on technology had become their downfall. They barked orders through the comms, urging their soldiers to regain control, but it was too late. The fear had set in. One alien soldier broke rank, stumbling backward, muttering in a language unfamiliar to human ears. The seal caught the shift, noting the way their formation dissolved further, their cohesion eroding with each second. They couldn't see him, couldn't hear him. He was the forest, everywhere and nowhere at once. In one swift, deliberate move, he picked up a stone and threw it toward the opposite side of their formation. It clattered against the tree, and the soldiers spun, firing blindly into the darkness, their laser beams slicing through leaves and bark but hitting nothing. The seal smirked, knowing he'd unsettled them to the core. Every shot they fired widened the cracks in their resolve, every wasted blast of energy another testament to their overconfidence. Back in the command center, one alien leader clenched his fists, disbelief and fury etched in his features. This shouldn't be possible. he growled, as another commander attempted to re-establish order, shouting into the communicator. "He's just one human. Maintain your positions!" The SEAL heard the broadcast, an invitation to press harder, but he moved carefully, never rushing, taking only calculated steps. He let their own fear do most of the work. The SEAL remained a shadow among shadows, watching as the alien forces began to unravel. They had tried everything: advanced scanners, thermal imaging, even deploying drones to scour the jungle. But none of it could penetrate the dense cover, and each attempt only underscored how unprepared they were for the terrain. Their technology, usually so reliable, was no match for an opponent who knew how to become invisible without it. As he observed, he could see the unease spreading through their ranks like wildfire. Every crackle in the underbrush, every bird taking flight, made them jump. Their rigid formation had devolved into scattered clusters, their trust in their own systems eroding with each failed scan. It was exactly what he had planned, sowing seeds of doubt until fear took root. With their attention fractured, he chose his next target, moving with precision to eliminate another soldier at the edge of the group. The alien went down without a sound, disappearing into the foliage before anyone noticed. By the time his comrades realized he was gone, the SEAL was already hidden, watching as panic bloomed in their faces. They searched frantically, calling his name in their language, but only the jungle answered, silent and indifferent. Another voice came through their comms, urgent and tense. A new order: pull back to regroup. But even that simple directive seemed impossible as the SEAL's tactics continued to confuse and isolate them. One alien, desperate, scanned the area with a shaky hand, while another nervously whispered to his squadmate. They were unraveling, their confidence eroded to the point that even their commanders' voices were losing authority. The SEAL waited, letting them come closer to each other, then used their brief moment of distraction to vanish once more into the dense growth. By the time they realized he'd slipped away again, frustration had turned to genuine fear. They weren't just hunting an enemy, they were haunted by a presence they couldn't see, couldn't track, and it gnawed at them, driving them further from the calm discipline they'd once possessed. The alien commanders watching from their distant view screens grew visibly tense. They issued new orders, commanding their soldiers to regroup and remain calm, but even they knew that morale was plummeting. Every communication revealed more panic, more desperation. They'd underestimated this human, thought him merely a nuisance, but now they could see they'd sent their troops into a trap of their own making. The jungle, once an annoyance, was now a prison, and the SEAL controlled every corner of it. In a final attempt to restore order, the commanders directed a fresh wave of soldiers to bolster the ranks, their orders sharp and insistent. But even these reinforcements faltered upon arrival, eyes wide as they encountered the anxiety radiating from the rest. The SEAL watched, noting how the newcomers immediately fell into the same patterns, their rigid lines giving way to fearful glances and hesitant steps. One of the aliens took a step back, a tremor in his hands, and began muttering in his native language, words that sounded like an appeal. The SEAL could tell the fear was becoming contagious. The troops around him glanced over, visibly shaken, a ripple effect spreading through the formation. Fear had taken hold, and it was no longer a weakness, it was a weapon. With a deliberate shift, he threw another rock, sending it skittering into a dense thicket to their left. Immediately, several soldiers aimed and fired into the underbrush, filling the air with blinding blasts of energy. But there was nothing there, just plants swaying in the aftermath. The SEAL noted the growing disarray, every shot fired exposing the futility of their efforts, each miss another crack in their belief in themselves. Another soldier backed away, muttering angrily at his superiors over his comms, demanding a new strategy. The commanders on the other end barked orders, trying to instill control, but the SEAL could sense their desperation as the soldiers hesitated, questioning every decision. The alien leaders had lost control, their arrogance had dissolved, replaced with urgency, and if the SEAL was reading them right, an edge of fear. At the command center, one of the lead aliens turned to his peers, eyes narrowed with frustration and barely concealed dread. "This isn't warfare. It's a massacre," he hissed, gripping the edge of his console. But none of them had a response. They could only watch helplessly as their finest troops were reduced to panicked prey. In the field, the SEAL felt the shift as his psychological advantage solidified. The once confident aliens, who had mocked his methods and humanity's lack of advanced cloaking, were now moving erratically, firing wildly, unable to see past their own panic. The jungle had turned against them, and he was its silent, patient guide. Seeing his moment, he advanced quietly, choosing his next target with care. The SEAL moved with quiet precision, every step calculated, every sound deliberate as he closed in on the remaining alien soldiers. The once unified ranks had splintered, each soldier watching his own back, scanning wildly for the ghosts that had been picking them off one by one. Their high-tech scanners, advanced training, and elite armor meant nothing now. They were trapped in a hostile environment, facing an enemy who knew the terrain intimately and whose tactics seemed incomprehensible. With their forces dwindling, the commanders had one last order: pull back. But their soldiers barely registered the command. Some were frozen in place, others argued into their comms, demanding extraction, while the most fearful muttered under their breath, desperate for any sign of their unseen adversary. They had come to hunt, yet here they were, hunted by someone they couldn't see and couldn't understand. One soldier, a higher-ranking officer, managed to rally a few remaining troops, his voice a mix of urgency and barely suppressed fear. He insisted they form a tight circle, weapons pointed outward, eyes darting into the trees. They stood back to back, gripping their weapons tightly, forcing themselves to focus, straining to detect any movement in the darkness beyond. But the jungle was a wall of shadows, a silent accomplice to the SEAL's strategy. Then, just as they began to think he might be gone, the SEAL made his presence known with a subtle shift, just enough to rustle a nearby bush. The soldiers tensed, their fingers on the trigger, hearts pounding as they aimed at the source of the noise. They fired in unison, lighting up the jungle in a cascade of blinding energy blasts, but the SEAL had already moved. He watched from the shadows, noting the panic in their eyes, the sweat beading on their faces as they searched for a target that no longer existed. The officer barked orders, demanding silence, trying to regain control. But it was too late. The SEAL could see it in their faces. They were broken. Each movement he made, every sound he used to bait them, only heightened their desperation. Their every attempt to find him failed, and their own fear became their undoing. They were lost in an endless cycle of anticipation, certain he was always one step ahead, and they weren't wrong. From a new position, the SEAL picked off another soldier at the edge of the formation. The others barely had time to react before he slipped back into the darkness, leaving them with one fewer and one step closer to complete collapse. Their comms were flooded with frantic voices, the commanders trying in vain to direct them, but the chain of command had broken, their discipline shattered. In the command center, the alien leaders exchanged looks of disbelief, their arrogance replaced with grim resignation. They had mocked this human, laughed at his primitive ways, but now they could only watch as he dismantled their elite troops with patience and precision. For the first time, they understood the power of an enemy who knew how to use fear, how to turn the environment into a weapon. The SEAL's tactics were like nothing they'd ever encountered, and their confidence had melted into dread. On the ground, the soldiers' formation broke entirely. One by one, they began to retreat, abandoning their posts, seeking any path back to safety. But in their panic, they moved erratically, unable to form any coherent plan. The SEAL watched as they stumbled through the jungle, their retreat turning into chaos, each one more concerned with survival than with any sense of loyalty to their leaders. The SEAL stepped forward, his face unreadable, knowing the job was done. He had left them shattered, their pride transformed into fear, their mocking laughter now a distant memory. There was no need for a final strike. The jungle had become his ally, its shadows his cover, and it had swallowed them whole. The few who survived stumbled back to the extraction point, exhausted, hollow-eyed, and silent. They had entered the jungle as conquerors and left as broken men. The commanders on the other end of the comms, realizing the scale of their failure, made the order to retreat official, withdrawing the remaining forces and calling off the hunt. They would not find this human. He had taught them a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. As the seal watched them retreat, he remained unseen, letting them go, knowing they would carry the story back to their leaders. He didn't need to chase them further. His work was done. He had shown them the power of simplicity, of patience, of tactics that required no high-tech devices, only an understanding of the land and a relentless will. Word of the encounter spread quickly through the alien ranks, tales of the human who had defied them, the one who had turned the jungle into a weapon, who had used fear as his greatest ally. They spoke of him in hushed tones, no longer mocking, but with a respect they had never intended to give. Back at their ships, the commanders watched the footage in silence, faces drawn with realization. They had underestimated this human and his kind. They had come to flaunt their superiority, yet they were leaving humbled, with a warning to others who might think to underestimate Earth's soldiers. The seal lingered a moment longer, then turned and vanished back into the jungle, a ghost once more.